that I can show you to give you a sense of the first minutes of this film. The first minutes to show you if the DVD plays, I'm not so sure it will, is from the English version of the film. I think you'll hear right away. I hope you will. I'm going to not give up so easy, though. Let me try this again. Yeah, the computer doesn't seem to know there's a DVD in it right now. But it did earlier, so that's why I'm a little frustrated. Maybe we can eject it and put it back in. So in English, we would say, I'm calling time, which means no, the time is stopping. There's no hope.
Sí. Creo que es el reproductor que no lo reconoce.
Good idea. This is why I'm not a cinema scholar.
Está dando error. Pero lo conseguimos antes, ¿no? No, pero es que el CD no sale. Por alguna razón se atoró. ¿Lo sacaste lo metiste antes? No, ya lo hemos comprobado. Sí, antes estuvimos viendo fragmentos y se podía. Por eso no estoy tan preocupado porque ya funcionado.
Of course. I mean, if we have to go on, we have to go on. I'm gonna assume I don't want to put anyone on the spot. But has anyone seen this film in this room? No. So I'm giving a lecture on a film that no one has had the ability to see, which is why I wanted to show a few minutes of it. But all I have is stills.
Sí, hay una mía. Está arriba. Si me bajas una bolsa mía. Sí.
It's impossible, I'll just go on.
No, ya hemos probado. Funcionó 5 minutos antes. In 5 minutes.
Okay.
If it's okay.
Yeah, we shouldn't stop.
We'll switch computers and
Okay, we'll see.
let's see when answer.
We could also put it on during the Q&A, if that works, just so it's on the screen and people can get a few minutes of it after hearing me talk about it for 4 minutes. But let me eject it and give it to you.
Yeah. No, todavía no. Así cuando podamos, yo voy a tratar de mientras. So you keep going. I take the video and I'll call you if everything works.
No, it's not going to come out.
Ay, sí. ¿Puedes comandar el escape? ¿Cómo? ¿Cuál? ¿Ah? No lo quieres dejar. No, ahora no. No te lo tocó antes de conectar la... Sí, sí, sí.
Well, it's a really great film, so it's a shame. I think it's fantastic. I wrote a whole paper about it. We're going to keep going, and if it's possible to show some minutes of the film to give you a sense for it before I'm done, we'll try with another computer. It seems to be, these computers no longer even have DVD players in them, so I know this is as old as my computer. So we're going to continue. Now, Dean would actually publish architectural plans of this Art Deco villa in the artist book that she made to accompany her project. While she did that, her film never allows a total apprehension of the site itself. Instead, each version stresses a kind of different voyage through the home by the old man, allegorical more generally of the voyaging and the questing that her work has always engaged. By contrast, her camera remains completely stationary in this film. It is usually focused on close-up views, a parquet floor, an iron grille, all the ornateness of the Art Deco details, often close up. The villa then is also shown through mostly deep angles, oblique positions for a camera. If instead she centers her camera within the space, we're then shown room after room receding far away into the distance. Dean's camera languishes and it lingers. There are no tracking shots in the entire film. It's always stationary. Instead, Boots begins to move slowly and laboriously through the building, often traversing at what it seems an almost painfully slow speed, the entire distance from left to right across a static shot or from top to bottom of the frame. It's as if he's traversing film and the camera and the screen as much as he is architectural space. Before we see him, in fact, we can hear him in the film, the heavy clump of his boot and his canes marking time and echoing throughout the empty space of the villa. Sometimes he speaks, on or off frame, but most often we listen to the echo of his step in this film, its resonance slowly filling the home like the golden light of the late-day sun that pierces the villa throughout the entirety of the film. With what I want to call the indolence or laziness, the stillness of Dean's camera. It's pressing close and holding on to partial details. We recognize that she approaches in her work the model of what's been called authorial divestiture. That again, I'm talking now of the critic Kaja Silverman, that Kaja Silverman has named the author as receiver. I want to press on this idea. It's an essay Silverman published around the time of the interview I already read to you, around 2001. Silverman elaborated this idea in relation to what now seems a classic example of what we could call a late artistic style, the perplexing work of the filmmaker Jean-Luc Godard from the 1990s as opposed to the classic years of his production in the 1960s and 1970s. Writing on these later works by Godard, such as the anti-autobiographical film JLG, JLG from 1994, Silverman points out in her essay that the author as receiver is attracted most often to images that use natural light, focus on found objects, and relish all sorts of documentary detail. Silverman follows Godard in imagining a kind of conceptual transvaluation of the outmoded technical support that we might think of as an analog receiver. And now, Jeannot, Jeannot, Silverman quotes Godard from the soundtrack of JLG, JLG. And now, Jeannot, Jeannot, remembering his childhood name, which rhymes with stereo. The rhyme continues, inspiring what Silverman calls a more profound relation. She's quoting Godard again. I, who listen and watch, Godard says, referring to his stereo, I am here because I receive this projection as I face it, end quote. In this model for Silverman, the artist can be conceived as not properly a creator, but rather the site where words and visual forms inscribe or install themselves, a receptacle, in other words, or a surface where the world finds its inscription. I have recourse, Silverman explains, to the metaphor of inscription as well as that of installation, because Godard himself sometimes thinks of the artist as a receptacle and sometimes as a writing surface. A kind of authorial detachment is then key to such work, for where the authorial ego reigns supreme, Silverman writes, what is negated then is the place where the world should be. She continues, it's consequently only insofar as the artist succeeds in negating him or herself as a biographical personage that he can truly be said to be an artist. Thus Godard, in a 1983 interview, I'm a person who likes to receive. The camera for me cannot be a rifle, since it's not an instrument that sends out, but an instrument that receives, and it receives with the aid of light. And perhaps more enigmatically, but beautifully, in the film again, JLG, JLG, I love. That is the promise. Now I have to sacrifice myself so that through me the word love means something, so that love exists on this earth. Like nostalgia, reception is a notion Silverman admits that has been thought of as problematic within politics and aesthetics usually. We want authors, now thinking of Walter Benjamin's term, we want authors and their audiences to be producers, active agents, not prone to the resignation, the inactivity, or even the passive acceptance in the face of what's simply given. That Silverman points out are the main associations with reception in the cultural domain. And yet the author as receiver is a model of transformation as well. Explicitly, it transvalues a set of technologies, the receiver, the analog, in the precise moment of their crisis and attenuation. But implicitly, it involves a dynamic even more radical than the limited project of rethinking notions of the author or of artistic making. For I think here we face a model of subjectivity as well, a rethinking of the very notion of what constitutes the subject, any subject, and the forms that subjectivity might in fact now take. At its most intense, Silverman's understanding of receiving in this model describes how one might conceptualize a kind of holding of oneself perpetually open to the world, which solicits one's desire and potentially transforms it, and is transformed by it. For receiving in this model is an aesthetic labor that depends on the workings of desire and memory. The Freudian notion that the finding, to use the famous quote from Freud, the finding of an object is in fact a refinding of it, is this labor's motto. Like Dean's impossible return in Boots to a lost home that is used as a platform for a spiraling series of new attachments and invented memories of this domestic space and home itself, the author as receiver follows the opening of desire not back to some implicitly maternal lost object of one's origins. Instead, turning back moves one forward as the world responds to that desire for a lost object, the absent origin, and expands upon its demand, opening up for those who will listen entirely new pathways for desire to displace forward. Entirely new, this is what Silverman calls them, associational fields. So here's one further quote, one description by Silverman of the model of memory that subtends her idea of the author as a receiver. She writes, by memory, I do not mean everyday recollection, but rather what psychoanalysis calls displacement. When we transfer libido from one thing to another, we do so on the basis of affinities between those two things. Likeness. An object choice consequently constitutes an act of recollection. We can displace in two radically different ways. We can savor that within a new object which replicates the old object of our desire, and discard everything which is in excess of that old relation. Or we can privilege what distinguishes the new object from the previous object of our desire. In the first case, displacement is fundamentally conservative, reactionary. It points backward in time. In the second case, displacement is transformative, actually. It reconceives the past in the form of the present. I am interested in the second rather than the first kind of displacement, and in a kind of memory which is actually more on the side of forgetting than memorialization. When we recollect in this strange way, we are worldly. We make room in our psyche for new objects and new things. This kind of memory is also aesthetic in the most profound sense of that word. It celebrates earthly forms for their shapes, colors, and patterns, rather than for their latent meanings. I call this kind of memory the passion of the signifier. When we are passionate about the signifier, we do not merely savor each new object in its specificity, we also connect it to ever new memories and new perceptions. We create an associational field around it. That is my last long quote. Okay. You have an option to show? Mm-hmm. Okay. Let's see.
No, it's going to be safe because it's from the...
So this is a very bad DVD copy. I would have like a 16-millimeter film that you would only see with the projector blurring right next to you in space. So you have to not tell the artist that I chose it to the public.
It was a lovely sunny day, and I heard a couple of flies buzzing around and a bee, and I was content. Suddenly felt that I would like to just sit down and have a 10-minute sleep. And I looked around and I found somewhere to sit, and I went to sleep for 10 minutes. And when I woke up, I thought I saw Blanche there, sort of funny, shady, colored silhouette. And I opened my eyes wide and it had gone. It vanished. So then I thought, well, that's probably enough of that. Forget her. Think of something different. It has the feeling, or I have the feeling, that they are still here, but in another dimension. And this whole house is in another dimension. It's not of the moment. If you know what I'm trying to say, it is difficult. But it is certainly not something one can put one's finger on and say it is now, it is another dimension. It's like being in a sort of peculiar dream. She doesn't have to be strong. And I don't think that woman had a chance, really, to be happy. She never found her level. You know, some people never find their level. Do you know what I mean by that? And that was the same with her. And having made this mistake, if you like, having sold herself, it never came back her chance to be happy. I don't know how she died either. Lost touch. Superb! All those mirrors. Looking into sexual pervert. Amazing place. Amazing. There's another car.
Okay. If you had a hard time understanding him, it's hard for an English native speaker to understand him as well. In fact, I'll just make an aside and say that the artist book that I've been referencing, made in relationship to this film, is simply a recording of everything he actually says, a kind of transcript as opposed to a script, because none of these spoken elements of the film were scripted, they were improvised. But to go back to this idea I'm trying to associate with the film, of the author as a receiver, thinking of it alongside Silverman as a model of something like a kind of aesthetic generosity that makes space not only for the world, but for the viewer. The openness and the displacement that receiving enacts also involves a kind of displacement of the self. Silverman states, the artist should not just receive. She should also be the relay for other acts of reception. In this way, one look can make possible a potential infinity of other looks, end of quote. Thus, in Boots, with Dean's filmmaking, chance events are always captured, it seems, in the film. A passing cloud causing the light to die within a room and just as quickly to revive. A cat running across the frame at the very end of the film. Dean describes this herself as a kind of aesthetic openness, and it's at the heart of her artistic method over the years. The idea of chance, she writes, has always interested me, but I think it depends as much on a facility to notice, being in something like a state of grace, as anything else, so that you're open to things. When you're actually immersed in something, you do notice connections, end of quote. And so what has been seen as Dean's programmatic return as an artist to the tactics of something like the historical tactics of structural film or structural filmmaking, the static camera, held as still as a photograph, the use of the fixed frame, the subtle play with repetition, with duration, with long segments of time itself, stretched filmic durations. All of this should be seen as twinned with an entirely other legacy in Dean's art, always, something more like the surrealist interest in the found object or in chance. Her filmic structuralism, so-called, is in fact a kind of abdication more of control, a receptive passivity that models a quite different linkage of the image to desire, I want to claim, the openness of the model of the author as receiver, and its subterranean quest for something like an endless libidinal series of displacements. Displacement now, the way I'm talking about it in this lecture, should be edging into, as you're hopefully understanding me, the idea of the expansion of forms, of film into photography, and vice versa, or of one artist into the viewer, one subjectivity into another. For this openness also makes room for the affect of the viewer, upon which Dean places inordinate stress, actually in all of her statements about her work. Asked about the perceiver, about whether the perceiver in fact makes the image appear in her art, Dean answered, I've always thought that art works best when it is open to this subjectivity, when it is not too bound by authorial direction and intent. After all, it can only ever exist in the subjective experience and the biography of the perceiver. There is no other place for art. So subjectivity and desire are at stake in Dean's film. In Boots, the newfound focus on a, quote, anachronistic human being, if we can conceive of that, announces this dynamic. And it is the resonating step, which I hope you heard, of the old man that immediately makes this apparent. I mean, what I hope you have sensed after seeing only 7 minutes or so of the film is that sound is excessively important for this film. And it was in sound, in Dean's work, actually, where we first, in fact, encountered Dean's elderly friend. A year before the making of the film, in 2002, Dean actually produced a sound piece entitled Berlin Project for the BBC radio. It's a kind of portrait of the city, Berlin, to which she had by then moved, through ambient sounds and some found recordings from the cinema, from the radio, that also edges into a displaced autobiographical collection of sounds, tracking through a kind of cinematic soundtrack, a life lived. The piece also, though, includes many snippets of conversation with Boots, the old man here, interviewed by the artist in that year. I'll return to this piece of 2002. It's not very well known. It's available to all of you to listen to. If you have any interest, it's on the website UbuWeb, which I hope is a resource many of you would know. UbuWeb, like Ubu Ra, Alfred Jarry's character, UBUWEB.com, and then look for Tacita Dean's name and it should come up. Where was I? I want to return to this project, the sound piece, to Boots' statements in that piece of 2002 and his voice in the prelude to the film Boots, that is the Berlin Project. But in the film, sound intensifies in importance, and the echoing sounds that Boots produces can actually be seen, can be claimed, I think, as one of the overarching tropes of the entire film. Echoes emerge everywhere. Dean's static shots resemble photographs, rhyming a form of cinema without a photography. The villa appears constantly pierced by light or thrown into momentary obscurity, like the camera obscura of the filmic apparatus itself. Just a year after making Boots, in a film that she entitled Palast, one of her key German films or works, like the Berlin Project sound recording, this film made in 2004, Dean elaborates this echo of architecture and photography or film into a kind of overarching logic of her work, the sign or metaphor of the condition of the receiver, in fact, as I've been discussing it. The film Palast makes the condition of the author as receiver self-reflexive, I think now, in a kind of inescapable way. As this film was made of the soon-to-be demolished and other architecture soon-to-be destroyed Palace of the Republic of the Old East Germany, and it focuses in on partial details of the building and relishes its mirrored surfaces, partial mirrored surfaces, at twilight, the end of a day, and the end of an historical period. Dean thus records less the architectural object than its crepuscular, fading, almost extinct receiving of the image of the cityscape and of the natural world that completely surrounds it, that becomes one with it during the moments of this film. But all of these tropes were already in place in Boots a year earlier, which has its own connections through its titular figure to Dean's subsequent films that she made in Berlin and in Germany, her so-called German works. In Boots, we see a series of windows during interior shots framing a moving world outside. We see the same windows during exterior shots mirroring the passing clouds and the setting sun that completely surrounds this villa, which is painted pink. And as the sun becomes more pink, the pink villa and it really become one. Echoing Dean's camera, or positioned analogous to a cinema screen, the villa's architecture becomes a kind of repository for the world around it. An apparatus, we might say, understood as a medium like film, a medium that here receives. The pink light of the late-day sun does not only bathe, but absorbs and echoes the villa, which is itself, as I just said, painted pink, as if the villa and the late day, the villa and light itself, had attuned themselves to one another. In each version of the film, a climax arrives, quote unquote. It's not a very exciting film, so it's not the traditional climax. Maybe for me, it's very exciting. The climax arrives as Boots lumbers around the Claire story, which is what you're seeing here, this space, at the heart of the home. Framed by a horizontal row of rectangular gaps between the Claire story's columns, we seem to see the movements relinquished by Dean's camera, taken up by Boots and the architecture now themselves. The Claire story, pierced like the villa's windows by light, amounts, as Kaja Silverman has observed in photography and film themselves, to what she calls a technology of radiance. It seems to echo and transform the segmented film frames of Dean's precious celluloid as if the substrate of 16mm film had been materialized in actual space, the analog of a strip of film made physical now before our eyes. And of course, all of these analogies are grounded, if that's the right word, in a more foundational one, which is the move that led Dean to place this entire fading villa into correspondence with her analog medium, but then to put both of these into correspondence with a beloved, very important to her, a beloved and aging old man. It had to be him, Dean explains of her choice to invite Boots to be in this strange film. No one else would do, she said. And so here, a home and a specific subject or subjectivity and the medium of film find one another. Like a spiraling series of discovered coincidences, each one is analogical to the other in this project. Each is like the other in their decrepitude, or their openness, or their age, or their slowed speed. Narrativized weekly as a return to home, Boots may correspond to the villa and to analog film, but he does not belong to them. He is, in fact, throughout the film, a loping interloper, imagining himself in the person of a one-time habitué of the villa, but also in the guise of an imagined and illicit lover, as that person who precisely was the force of disruption and disintegration within the story of this home itself and its history. Picturing a home that is found more than one to which one returns, an enigma more than that which is familiar, the movement of Boots eschews the traditional nostalgic logic of a kind of return to origins then, exchanging this for a series of analogical moves, of like attuning itself to like, expansions and connections across the vast chasms of both distance and of time. coming together in what has to be called this improper way, with none belonging to the other, no sense of belonging in sight. Boots can take his filmic voyage through the aging villa as if endlessly. He can and seems to invent the past. He improvises his memories, opening up a falsifying history and story that perhaps never occurred and occurs in each of the 3 meetings of Boots and the villa in a different language and differently. In Boots, the nostalgic signifiers then move laterally, side to side. Analogy is about contiguity, about comparison, about movements from side to side, rather than the verticality of a return to origins or of truth to form. We might think of analogy this way as a kind of way of betraying form itself, moving one form into correspondence with another. The lateral, indeed, is one characteristic of the modality of nostalgia that Svetlana Boym, in her book that I mentioned earlier, The Future of Nostalgia, one of my favorite ideas from it is this idea she has of what she calls the off-modern. And she was thinking of those objects and styles and authors in the recent history of modernity who neither held to the tenets of modernism nor returned strictly to tradition, but instead confused the valences or meanings of those 2 opposed poles in modernity: modernism, tradition. Many of Dean's subjects are in fact off-modern in this precise way. In Boots, we could of course say that Art Deco itself, as a style, is a prototypical off-modern object or style, a kind of nostalgia moderne that is also then a temporal hybrid, looking backward in the language of the future or forward in the language of the past, however you want to see this strange anachronism of Art Deco as an architectural style. The off-modern for Boym offers what she calls a critique of both the modern fascination with newness and the no less modern reinvention of tradition. The off-modern takes neither the road forward nor the return to the past, but instead confuses our sense of direction, opening up the exploration of side shadows and back alleys rather than the straight road of progress, allowing, film wants to expand, allowing a detour from the deterministic narrative of history. I'm still quoting from Boym. She explains that off here means for her something like aside from the modern, but also off stage, extending and branching out from. Off can also mean somewhat crazy and eccentric in English, off key, off beat, occasionally off color. It's a tradition within modernity that shows that, again, I'm quoting Boym, cultural evolution doesn't always happen through a direct line from parents to children, but through a lateral line from uncles and aunts. Marginalia of a given epoch doesn't simply become its memorabilia. It might contain kernels of the future, she writes. Why am I quoting all of this to you? Well, I want to claim that Tacita Dean is an artist whose modality, in fact, is the lateral move. The lateral inhabits her very choice of form. She films most often in an anamorphic widescreen format, a form that really pushes cinema laterally, travels wide, holds objects together almost impossibly from side to side. With her films, she usually writes accompanying texts, essays, that range alongside her cinematic explorations. For every cinema project, there is a written text, and she calls each one of these texts not an essay, they're all called asides. An aside, an aside, an aside. Tacita Dean's collected essays are called an aside. A recent film documenting the connections of her own family to the history of cinema in the United Kingdom, she's named The Uncles. It's a little too complicated a story to tell, but her family was crucial to the invention of a cinema industry in the United Kingdom on both sides of her family. In one movie that she has also then recently made about old women as opposed to old men, Dean stresses a kind of sibling or lateral relation, focusing on a lingering order of Irish nuns in a film that she entitles The Presentation Sisters. We have uncles, we have sisters. This lateral movement, the tactic of the aside, is the figure in Dean's art of her dedication, I want to say, to formal expansion. We're constantly moving aside, turning awry, moving beyond, from work to wall, in Dean's film about Joseph Beuys, the Darmstadter Werkblock, from architecture aside to the surrounding urban space in the reflections that I just showed you in the stills of Palast, the endless or infinite lateral push of the rotating anamorphic lighthouses, or the dining room in the spinning television tower of Fernsehturm. With each subject of Dean's films further analogized to filmic form itself, spinning, spreading, projecting light out into the darkness, ticking, roiling like celluloid or ocean waves, we begin to sense the sense of Dean's understanding of and attachment to film itself as a medium to which he does not simply want to cling, as she is often depicted or described as an artist, to move us back to, insisting on the analog, insisting on the old film stocks, to which she wants to return or which she wants simply to salvage. For instead, Dean's understanding of film as an engine of transformation, expansion, analogy, signaled repeatedly by its lateral moves, what I want to call its asideness, its sense of being off. Which brings us back to Boots. I'm almost done at this point. I think it's important that Boots refused to play the architect in Dean's film, and instead insisted on identifying with what he called a lover. For in this, he seems to reject the role of being an originator, the creator of the villa's form, its architecture, even though this was his actual profession in his real life. Subsequent to the making of Boots, in the wake of the Mario Merz film, a flood of aging old men seemed to be unleashed across the face of Dean's films. I just really want to underline how strange this is in the production of any contemporary filmmaker artists, especially women filmmaker artists, to devote their film work to, and it seems at this point, an endless stream of portraits of old men. Some of these men were already lost, now dead, artistic father figures to be mourned, it seems. In her work, Dean has attempted to find Robert Smithson's massive earthwork, The Spiral Jetty. She has lingered in the abandoned studio space of Marcel Brotauer's Dusseldorf studio. She has filmed the decrepit walls, as I've discussed, around a Joseph Beuys installation in Darmstadt. Some of the old men were captured like Boots in the last moments of their long life, like the artist Mario Merz, just before his death. He died just after the making of his film. Dean has dedicated a film to Sensaku Shigeyama, a traditional Japanese actor, then in his 80s when she filmed him, deemed by the Japanese state what they call a human treasure, and this then became the title of Dean's film, portraying him. And then there is the film of Michael Hamburger in his home and his apple orchard shortly before his passing at the age of 82 in the summer of 2007. More recently still, Dean has devoted works to Cy Twombly, her film titled with his actual real name, Edwin Parker, to Merce Cunningham, 2 films dedicated to Merce Cunningham, and to the art historian Leo Steinberg, whose hand I'm showing you here, and which became a photo piece rather than a film called The Line of Fate. Dean says about this turn in her work, "Obviously, I have a father complex," she joked in a recent interview. I actually just want to read you a few lines from this interview. It's pretty extraordinary as a self-statement of an artist's understanding of their own production. She was talking to the author and writer Marina Warner. This was 10 years ago. Warner writes, "At that point, there were still many old men to be coming in the films that happened after this interview. There are a lot of father figures in your work." Dean responds, "I know. What do you make of it?" And this is when she says, "Obviously, I have a father complex. I've noticed a few things. I know I say that I'm very blind to what I do, but I do have a lot of disappearing men in all of my work. A lot of disappearing male artists as well, which I think is interesting, disappearing men. There is something I didn't consciously seek, but there's Marcel Brotauer's, Robert Smithson, Mario Merz, the sailor Donald Crowhurst." The writer Marina Warner responds to her, "Some of them are voyagers like Odyssean questers. When you say a lot of men in your works have died or vanished, that sounds as if you're setting yourself up as Oedipal in this way. But I would have thought you were trying to restore them to life, rather than make them all disappear." Dean responds, "I think that is what I do anyway. Sometimes when I have a film like Mario Merz, all I can say about it consciously is that I'm really glad it exists. That's what I can say about my film The Uncles too. I'm really glad it now exists, that it traps something that really is disappearing in the world. All of the things I'm attracted to are just about to disappear, more or less. Now it's people, but before it was objects and buildings." Okay, that's the end of the quote. Obviously, I have a father complex. The film Boots shows this to be not exactly true, at least in the traditional sense. When I stopped the film, I was at the scene I'm showing you right now. And it was really hard to understand what he says in this scene, but I want to claim this scene was actually quite crucial. Rejecting the role of the architect and taking on that of the lover, Boots wanders through the house like an Equester, Odyssean voyager, filling the home with amorous memories, and many of them often do verge toward the sexually explicit. He imagines Blanche at one point nude in her bathtub, here. He remembers their avoidance of what he calls in his British English simple sex. Upon viewing the bedroom, he says, "We did some quite interesting things together, which I quite liked doing." Upon seeing his reflection, and this is where I stop the film, in the many mirrors of the villa's bathroom, Boots exclaims, "All those mirrors, they make you into a sexual pervert." If you didn't hear what he said, that's what he was saying. Pervert. Pervert. To corrupt. To turn the wrong way. To turn about. Boots' mirror reflections travel in multiple and opposed directions in this scene. And with this, Boots seemed to signal that Dean's work, we might say, is herself a labor of the pervert. I know it sounds a little strange, but bear with me. Which perhaps could be spelled in French instead, pervers, a father veering or a father turning, but also a turn away from the father. Boots, instead, we could say, is a kind of exploration of a lost and non-Oedipal father, perhaps even a kind of an attempt to state what it would be like to imagine an escape from the father, or a deeply paradoxical extolling, praising, elegizing of a wayward, exiled father figure of a type. None of these are the associations that we usually associate with the figure of the father in myth, in psychoanalysis. All of this, again, though, was telescoped just before the making of Dean's film in the audio piece that is the Berlin project that I described to you a few moments ago. So now, as I'm wrapping up, I want to do something really terrible, which is to play the last seconds of this recording. Like, spoiler alert, but there's no spoilers. But I am going to do the horrible thing and play for you the ending of something. So if you want to plug your ears and not hear it, I don't advise it, but you could do that. The last minute or two of this recording, the end of the whole thing, and the last snippet of the interview that we hear the artist conducting with Boots, interspersed with all the found sounds and found audio, the city sounds that makes up this sonic portrait of Berlin, we could say, but also a sonic portrait of the creator of the piece, I also want to claim. So, let me find the recording. No? Where'd it go? So many things over here. It is.
Let's sing another song, boys. This one has grown old and bitter, old and bitter, old and bitter, old and bitter, old and bitter.
Mommy's last words too. She said, "It's like going down a rabbit hole." It's good, isn't it? Of things I've never told anybody else. That's because you're Tacitus, my twin. Isn't it, darling? There.
That's not from my presentation. I know, I realize I'm over time at this point, so I'll try to bring us to a conclusion. We hear Boots' last words there in the end of the sound recording, talking about his mother's last words. I remember Mommy's last words too. She said, "It's like going down a rabbit hole." It's quite good, isn't it? Yes. "I've told you a lot of things I've never told anybody else. That's because you're Tacita," he says to her, "my twin. Isn't it, darling?" A sigh of exhaustion. There. Hold on to this assertion. Hold on to the sigh, the evident exhaustion at the end of all. That's because you're Tacita, my twin. And consider a last set of coincidences, perhaps they're analogies. Usually Dean details in the writing all of the uncanny chain of events that leads her to each of her given projects or films. This is the task of each of her texts that she calls asides. Boots, however, is the only film for which Dean has not, in fact, written an aside. None exists. The artist book that I told you a moment ago that is published alongside the film is instead a simple transcript of Boots' spoken monologue, more dialogue, more words, and a listing of all the individual shots. We might with this wonder if the coincidences evinced by this work are more intensely personal in this instance, or perhaps more intimately related to Dean's own biography than the distance meditation of the film initially would seem to suggest. Perhaps they're even obscure and unplumbable for its author. But there is a chain of correspondences and chance of coincidences that structure this film. First, for Dean, Boots was a father figure, but of a particular and very strange kind. In her actual life, he was her sister's godfather, a move that relates her to him laterally through her sibling, her older sister, and then laterally again in a move outside of any traditional familial or Oedipal dynamic, to use the psychoanalytic term. He had been an architect, like Dean is now herself an artist. And indeed, Dean has admitted in her text about this figure to a kind of deep, deep identification with him, but not the kind of identification that usually pertains in the psychoanalytic stories between a father and a child. Instead, in newspaper articles and interviews around the making of the film Boots, Dean has noted that Boots, in fact, this is true, has the exact same birthday as herself. They were born on the same day. And thus she always considered him, and in fact calls him, as we now have heard him call her, her twin, a kind of sibling of the most intense kind. Compounding this, Dean has long thought Boots a kind of romantic or glamorous figure since her childhood, and with his exaggerated limp and his orthopedic boot, even a kind of Byronic one. For the romantic poet, Lord Byron, also had a club foot. But with this, Boots again became a kind of uncanny precursor. So I'm showing you a 1991 drawing collage that Tacita Dean made where she was already thinking of this chain of figures, father figures, Oedipus himself, Lord Byron the poet, and her friend and twin, Bootsy, in a series of collaged images of a series of what seem like perhaps female feet. But with this now, Boots became a kind of uncanny precursor, for now in her own life, Dean in fact suffers deeply from a really bad case of rheumatoid arthritis, usually a disease of one's old age, which came on for her in her 30s. All of the limping that I do is interesting. All of the limping in the film is interesting because now I limp, Dean has stated of Boots, noting the arthritis that has caused the deep swelling and deformation of her own limbs. Also around then, the time of the making of the film Boots, she made a series of photographs of these baobab trees, and I think precisely because of their swollen forms that she was also now tracing in this other filmic project. And this last correspondence raised for Dean an entire set of Oedipal stakes in her work as something like, again, pure coincidence. But it's a story of an Oedipus gone awry, an Oedipus gone strange, gone wrong. This is where Dean's connections to Boots become rather strange and tortured, almost impossible to conceptualize or to follow. Biography again. It's in fact the case, this is not made up, this is truth, whatever truth is, that Tacita Dean's older sister that I've kept referring to was named by her father and mother Antigone. Her older brother is Ptolemy, her older sister is Antigone, and she is Tacita. Antigone, of course, is the name of the daughter of Oedipus. This seems to confirm Boots' position as a father figure, as Boots/Oedipus relates as godfather to Dean's Antigone, her, in fact, real-life sister. But of course, things here are infinitely more complex, and you all know the Oedipal story. For Antigone was not only the daughter of Oedipus, she was also his sister. And this turns Oedipus at the myth's origin into an avatar, killed your father, slept with your mother, you know Oedipus, right? This turns Oedipus at the myth's origin into an avatar of a monstrous, deeply hybrid relation, of course, both a father and a brother at once, which we could restate, if we wanted to, in a more utopian way, as perhaps I think Dean does in her film. Boots here is a strange filmic figure. He is a father-brother. Dean, a kind of sister-daughter. And in the film, the lateral and oblique relation of the sibling or the twin overtakes the linear and vertical logic of the parent or the father. Indeed, the Oedipal father in the great psychoanalytic narrative embodies a logic of renunciation, not participation. The Oedipal father insists on the law as a principle of division, of male from female gender, of self from other. But Boots in this film is dedicated to the exact opposite. He seems to memorialize, this film memorializes an aging man who opens up endless analogies and comparisons between himself and everything that surrounds him. The film then almost amounts then to a portrait, I want to say, of Dean herself. That's what this film project is. But seen through, analogically, her time sibling and her twin, an impossible vision in an imagined future tense occasioned by a fantasy of history in the past. This is only logical, even if it doesn't sound like it is. For the author as receiver is always creating self-portraits, we might say, but only as the self opens up to the world, only as the self becomes other. Her self-portraits are thus the portraits of others too. This is what's hard to think and must be thought through. To return to the conversation with Marina Warner, one might immediately ask, what kind of feminist vision is this for a contemporary artist, filmmaker? Psychoanalytically speaking, Dean's work hardly seems a transgressive war on the father, nor does it engage in what we might call a pre-Oedipal type of dynamic, as much recent feminist work has done. But it's not anti-Oedipal either. And this is kind of obvious in everything that she does. The father is everywhere. Perhaps we could call it post-Oedipal, but only in the most radical and non-traditional sense, I want to say, of that term. Dean's focus on old age and old men, on late subjects as well as late objects, seems to register what we might begin to conceptualize as a specific form of what I want to call Oedipal fatigue now. In Oedipal fatigue, one does not return to the father as origin or as progenitor. Instead, Oedipal fatigue gives witness to the running down and the old age of subjectivity itself. Now the father abdicates his role and is no longer a patriarch, nor a symbolic avatar of the patria, the nation, or the homeland. Instead, Oedipal fatigue emerges like a kind of Deleuzian line of flight, like the philosopher would say, an evacuation of symbolic authority. And with it, the father becomes, through sheer exhaustion, an exile and a wanderer, displaced from the symbolic domain itself. I'm fantasizing that this might exist, that something like Oedipal fatigue might be possible, and this film might try to imagine it. Often occasioned by the softening of age, even more by the confrontation with one's own death or mortality, Oedipal fatigue transforms the father from a figure of law and renunciation, punishment and retribution, into something else. a repository, perhaps, a human treasure at times, a ruin, ultimately, like the critic Walter Benjamin's vision of the same, what he said of the ruin, merging with the setting or with nature is how he described the ruin. Oedipal fatigue presents us with the ruins of the father, and these ruins can be wonderfully capacious and giving and open. It's the sign of the opening up of subjectivity itself. And so, and here I'm ending, as each version of Boots comes to its end, each of the 20-minute films, as each version ends with, in fact, the setting of the sun and the coming on of night, Dean has called her entire project a valediction. It amounts to a farewell. In the English version of the film, Boots waves to the villa and says with great frailty, almost like a child, bye-bye. In the French version, he actually breaks into Italian, ciao, ciao. The villa would be renovated shortly after the making of Dean's film, and then Boots himself passed away a few months thereafter. But it's not just analog film, an architectural object, or a treasured old man, to which we bid farewell in this valediction. It's also a symbolic order, a way in which the image has been ruled. Instead of origins and returns, the image will be displaced by the lateral, by openness, by analogy. It will be riddled by the entropy of Oedipal fatigue and the unraveling of historical time, what we call paternal time, father time. Oedipal fatigue thus amounts to another kind of abdication, a kind of leave-taking, both in terms of desire, but also in terms of aesthetic form. And it also opens onto a form of love, an aesthetic itself, of attunement and affection, like the bathing of Boots' own body in Dean's vision of golden crepuscular light. It's a form of love for the aged and for the father that we really hardly have the tools at this point to understand. But Tacit Dean's focus on old age and on lateness amounts to a way of registering this Oedipal fatigue. I want to call it a fatigue again for the last time with the linear and the vertical, both in terms of time and of desire, of movement otherwise and laterally, toward analogy and likeness, an aesthetic for film of siblings and twins. It's a fatigue, an exhaustion, that I want to claim as the first condition of the expansion of Dean's cinematic form. So I've gone on too long for sure, and I'll end there. So what are we doing?
Gracias, George. Thank you for your amazing lecture. Tenemos unos cuantos minutos para un par de preguntas. Nada más, les pido por favor que quien las vaya o quien la vaya a hacer hable directamente al micrófono y hable muy claro para que el equipo de traducción pueda traducirle a George y no haya como problemas ahí de interpretación.
¿Puedo hacer mi pregunta en inglés? ¿Está bien? George, thank you for a beautiful talk about a beautiful piece. It occurred to me when you're talking about pervert. One could, I was thinking of, it's probably a more Lacanian definition of perversion, but the idea would be the pervert gives him or herself over to the other. So this would be another way of considering the idea of the receptivity of the artist, right? And the second thing, and you partially anticipated, I guess this is not a question as much as an invitation, but you pointed to how significant it is that he rejected the idea of becoming the architect, right? And architect evokes, of course, arche, origin, already. So I'm wondering, I guess, or inviting you, would it be productive to think what would happen in this piece had he taken up the position of architect, or does the piece not work at all in that light? Thank you.
Thank you. Those are amazing observations. So I'm writing them down. That's already very useful to me. Well, that's what she wanted. I mean, she has spoken a lot about this film. The film was made in 2003, at which point she had her first larger retrospective exhibition. It was in Paris, and this film was positioned as the kind of climax of that exhibition project. So it was an opportunity in which she was speaking about the work a lot. And it was the case that that was her plan for the work. If she had a plan, if she had an intention, authorial intention, it was this strange compulsion that she felt to bring her family friend into her work, to invite him to come to this villa that she wanted to film. And since he had been an architect, she thought that was the coincidence that would be articulated. That he had been an architect, here was the architecture she was interested in, and he could speak about it from the vantage point of an architect. She didn't really think that through, and he rejected it. So, I mean, that was the intention. What you're wondering, what it would mean for the film if he had played the architect, he refused violently, actually. He violently refused to do it. And I'm not sure if she understood why he violently refused, but she was clearly open in her process to that being an abdication of her authorial control over the film. If he wanted to be a lover, if he wanted to remember his love affair with Blanche and speak about love in the space of the architect, that was what she would let him do. That's the setup of the film. That seems to be how it came to be. It sounds almost too convenient, but that's what we know of the film. That's what the architect, that's what the artist, Tessa Dean, has allowed us to know of the film. Robert Steen is no longer with us to talk about it. He never, to my knowledge, spoke about the film himself after it was made. I don't know exactly how many months he lived after the making of the film, but this was very much the end of his life. So that's not an answer to what you just asked me, but you were giving me observations, and I'm giving observations back. This was a story of intention and intention's relinquishment. Be the architect, now I'll be a lover. The whole film is then structured around that concept. And I guess my claim for the film as I'm reading it is that it becomes a kind of cinematic meditation on desire and love, where we're not usually faced with this kind of visual signifier of a male body at the end of its long life, in all its decrepitude and deformity and decay, black spot on the nose, clubbed foot, clunking through the space. This could be the signifier of a meditation on love, is the impossibility of what I wanted to think aesthetically in the talk today with you, because I think that's what the film is. I'll put this back on.
En español te voy a hablar. Yo quiero hacer una reflexión sobre la película y sobre el coloquio como una síntesis. La primera parte tiene que ver con las imágenes que se vieron. Me ha recordado mucho a las fotografías de los Becher, de estos fotógrafos alemanes que fotografiaban espacios de fábricas abandonadas, como toda una serie que desarrollaron en los años 50, bueno, durante mucho tiempo.
The Beschers. Bernd and Hannah Becher, you're thinking.
Sí, yes. Y cómo, porque en realidad la película es como si fueran realmente en un plano fijo, es como fotografía en realidad, más que imagen en movimiento, ¿no? Es como volver a la materialidad, un poco como lo que también estabas planteando, y es ahí donde quiero juntarlo con lo que se vertió aquí, como esa nostalgia también de volver a la materialidad. Es como que no quisiéramos ver lo que viene de adelante y estuviéramos inmersos en una nostalgia fílmica y de los planteamientos que estéticamente se dieron como origen de este fenómeno, pero que ya no funcionan ahora para entender lo que está pasando. Y creo que debemos de dar también como un salto conceptual, a veces puede ser como a lo mejor un salto al abismo, pero para ver qué hay más allá también. Es como mi planteamiento, ¿no? Creo que si no damos ese salto vamos a seguir dando vueltas como hámster y eso nos ahoga en la nostalgia. Bueno, ese era todo el planteamiento.
Okay, that I'm responding in English. This is a first for me. I was compelled by many of your observations. They're quite beautiful, actually. If I understand the comparison to someone like Bertrand Hillebescher's photographs, I feel that too. I agree with that. And if I understood what you then said about the return to materiality, the cinematic return to a kind of stillness, I tried to signal my understanding of that reading of a filmmaker like Tacita Dean. When she first began to show her films, one of the places they were received, one of the ways they were received, was by comparing them, like many artists of the 1990s, back to structural filmmaking in the 1960s and 1970s, back to the earlier moment of expanded cinema. But the idea of the fixed frame, the motionless cinematic film, in that lens, the way in which structural film was most often understood, stressing the photographic basis of the film still, of the filmic frame, was a way in which one could acknowledge the medium. It was a medium specificity argument and tactic. I always sensed that an artist like Tacita Dean was, the film was never actually still. The frame was fixed, but there was always something in motion, even if it was just sonic. But usually there is motion in the film of some almost imperceptible kind. And so you're in an actual, more uncomfortable, more strange space, I would call it a hybrid space, between stillness and motion in all of this work. And so I think the task that presented itself to me at an earlier point in my own writing before engaging Tacita Dean's work in the way I've done tonight, engaging it more superficially, engaging it more basically. For me, her work became one example of many, of artists not stressing the filmic nature of film, not stressing the photograph as the basis of the medium, but seeking places between mediums, between photography and film. That's, for me, a new way of thinking expansion, and the expansion of cinema, that I think this film meditates upon in many different ways. So if we had the luxury and leisure to watch the entirety of the film, not just the 7 minutes or so that I could show, there's many different ways in which she plays with stillness and a static image, or the almost motionless image. There's many different ways in which scenes in the film compare themselves to photographic images that have no motion at all. But she always winds up in a kind of space that's less medium-specific or truth to form, and more about betraying form. That's how I think it. More about expanding how we understand the cinematic or the photographic or a medium like film. That's the way, those are the thoughts your comments bring to my mind. And maybe you were talking about something completely different, and I misunderstand, and I apologize if I do.
¿Alguien más tiene una pregunta? No. Bueno, pues, thank you, George.
Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias por acompañarnos durante la jornada del día de hoy. Les recordamos que mañana empezamos a las 10 en punto. Y pues nada, bienvenidos otra vez al VII Coloquio Universitario de Análisis Cinematográfico.